Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology here at Loyola Marymount University, where I also direct the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies. And I'm so happy to welcome you into this space. And we will begin with an invocation by Vijay.
Satyam Shivam Sundaram Satyam Shivam Sundaram Om Namah Shivaya. O Supreme Cosmos, O Absolute Brahman, O dancing Natarajan, in symmetry and splendor, O destroyer of devil, creating souls with beauty. Om Namah Shivaya. Satyam Shivam Sundaram Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Bholenath Asutosh Shambho Vaishnavanam Yatha Shambho, showing the path of truth in ocean of love, in the bliss, in the bliss. Om Namah Shivaya. Satyam Shivam Sundaram Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Atha Brahma Jigyasa Janma Adi Asayata, primeval cause of all causes, of creation, sustenance, destruction, manifested universe for us to play. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om. Tasat. Hari Om Tatsat. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. O dancing Natarajan, in symmetry and splendor, guide us to transcend from somatic to psychic towards spiritual self, towards spiritual self. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. for truth in bliss. Hold on to that state, never let go. Hold on to, yes, hold on. Just hold on, never let go that state. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Effluent light of infinite photons, undivided enlightening for truth in ocean of love, for truth in bliss, for truth in bliss, mind in state of Satchidananda, Satchidananda, Satchidananda. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. O Supremo, O Supreme Cosmos, O Absolute Brahman, O dancing Natarajan in effulgence and bliss. Human mind having no location, like photons having no position, searching for absolute truth, searching for absolute truth. Devoid of anger and hate, devoid of pain and pleasure. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Mind full of love and compassion, now in light of absolute truth, enter the field of infinite gravity, singular, 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 as a black hole, as a black hole. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Beyond nature, space and time, out of manifested matters and forms, no more Maya, wailing Brahman. No more Maya, veiling Brahman, within reality of pure being, the reality of supreme consciousness. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Aham bija prada pita mayam etam tarantite pragyanam brahma tattvamasi ayam atman brahma aham brahmasmi yes aham brahmasmi yes, we are all divine. we are all divine. Om Namah Shivaya. O Supreme Cosmos, we are all conscious, we are all one Brahman, self-conscious Brahman. Hari Om Tassat, Hari Om Tassat. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Satyam Shivam Sundaram. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah
And I would like now to invite Professor Dr. Dean Robin Crabtree of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts within Loyola Marymount University.
Good evening, everyone. Namaste. Wow, that was incredible. It's hard to move from that space into these, into a bunch of words, but I'll pave the way for you, Jay, so that you feel like it's just going to flow right from there. So on behalf of the leadership of Loyola Marymount University, President Timothy Law Snyder, who's not with us, and Provost Poon, who is with us, it's my honor to welcome everyone to our beautiful campus and, of course, to this signature event. This is one of those times every year where we celebrate extraordinary individuals and organizations that contribute to creative and productive interplay of faith and reason, which is, of course, foundational to Catholic and Jesuit higher education. And especially having so many people from surrounding communities and also students, faculty, and staff from here at LMU is lovely to see you all together and just to be back, really back, right? But especially the South Asian community has supported and engaged with LMU through the Bridgebuilder Award, through other events, through our yoga studies program, and so on. And you really honor us with your engagement with our community. I'm definitely excited to welcome Dr. J. Bhattacharya of Stanford University to LMU. It's such an honor to have you here, and we're also excited about your talk. LMU is a place that encourages, convenes, and facilitates a vibrant intellectual and interreligious dialogue on topics of the deepest importance to understanding the full human experience. Through the Doshi Family Bridgebuilder Award, we're able to honor together each year an individual or organization that has demonstrated a unique and sustained dedication to fostering understanding between and among cultures, peoples, and disciplines. And this award and its many distinguished honorees, I can't list them all, but Deepak Chopra, Thich Nhat Hanh, Vandana Shiva, Rupert Sheldrake, Sadhguru, on and on we go, who have been hosted here. These folks animate and extend our university mission in so many important ways. And so this will be no different. This year's Doshi Family Bridgebuilder Award recipient and lecturer further consolidates this longstanding record of excellence. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya embodies the interdisciplinary, impact-oriented research that we value and try to model here at LMU, and that is such an integral part of the educational experience we are endeavoring to offer to our undergraduate and graduate students. His topic tonight is among the most critically important to our times, and only the interdisciplinary approach he takes can illuminate the total impact of the pandemic or lead us to solutions, to responses that that even begin to get at the totality, at the complexity and the breadth beyond the next or even this emergent health crisis, but really towards a lens on equity and justice more broadly, more complexly. So this award and its founders and honorees really manifest, I think, the values and advance the goals of a liberal arts education in the Jesuit and Marymount traditions. We're so grateful for the vision and leadership of Naveen and Pratima Doshi, who have partnered with us for so many years, and of course founded the Doshi Bridgebuilder, Family Bridgebuilder Award. They've been such amazing friends and partners, have brought so many wonderful people and communities into the LMU family. So let me just take this opportunity once again, most heartfelt gratitude to both of you, to your family, and just to offer my personal congratulations to Dr. Bhattacharya. Thank you.
So we have a few words before more words, and Naveen has asked me to introduce the first part of what he has written, and then Naveen will set another way of regarding our event today. So thank you all for being here in the spirit of, we can call it the Buddhist middle path or Madhyamaka, articulated by the philosopher Nagarjuna. And a Chinese scholar, Xuanzang, a giant of bridge building, traveled through the grueling terrain of Gansu, step upon step, enduring the deadly heat of the Gobi Desert and the desolate and treacherous ice peaks of the Pamir Mountains, enduring long periods of solitude and a quest for truth. During this 17-year journey, he traced the footsteps of Buddha and Nagarjuna, walking past the Greco-Indian statues of Gandhara, coming all the way down into India to the university at Nalanda, learning the Buddhist schools, embracing Yogacara, learning Buddhist metaphysics, some many, many centuries before Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Similarly, we see that intuitive and intellectual approaches have long been the subject of conversation, of debate, even between Rabindranath Tagore and Einstein. Tagore, the poet, intuitively disagreed with Einstein, stating that the participating observer does influence the process of observation, resulting in multiple outcomes. And this, in effect, supports Schrodinger's equation of quantum mechanics and the uncertainty of outcome. We hope through our bridge building to manifest a path of moderation. This is the teaching that we find not only in the Buddha, but with the Katha Upanishad and the Bhagavad Gita. And these ways of regarding also came to the Mediterranean world and influenced both pre-Socratic thought as well as the Neoplatonists in significant ways. So there are many pathways within the journey to moderation, the middle path. Bridge building, coexistence, avoidance of polarization, moving away from pairs of opposites. And even though it is nature's way to create pairs of opposites, we must recognize the need for both. The dark half of the pair, such as ignorance, also becomes the raw material for the brighter half, like wisdom. There's a little bit of good in the worst of us and some bad in the best of us. The path of transcendence is to bring balance, harmony, and complementarity to this problem of opposites. Nature itself is fractal, layered at every level of our existence. Our somatic layer, our psychic layer need to work together to prolong life itself. Though born out of physical energy, the somatic self is inseparable from the psychic. And yet the psychic self of artists and poets is powerless in the material world. It is like an angel flapping its wings, moving against gravity to transcend toward the heavens, with power-hungry materialists aiming to shoot it down like a game bird. The Western mindset of pure logic needs to be complemented with the traditionally intuitive Eastern mindset of compassion and complementarity. Quantum mechanics supports this notion that we are participants, even in material manifestation. The Western belief, I think, therefore I am, can be changed to, I think, because I am. Thoughts come and go and die with the somatic body, but the consciousness or the Christhood or the Atman or the Buddha nature exists forever. Today, it seems that humanity has become severely polarized. We need to move out of the unipolar mindset, the idea that the USA is in charge of it all, and we must accept a multipolar world where every country and even every person is sovereign. At a professional level, if Western countries had let doctors remain autonomous and let them practice their profession during COVID, perhaps tens of thousands of lives could be shared. And spared, I should say.
Digital technology is associated with information and culture, but it has been also capitalized and mixed with commodity capital of the somatic self. Power-hungry materialists are using and mixing these technologies to take away the freedom of mind and autonomy. They have been proposing implementing microchip. They have been proposing implanting microchip in a newborn baby. That could also result into humanity becoming robotic, receding psychic and philosophical self with the loss of freedom and autonomy. Macroeconomics of today has been poisoned with public debt of over $140 trillion, with an overhang of 700 trillion derivative markets. In an environment of shrinking credit and GDP, rising rate of interest and inflation and shrinking productivity, the future is gloomy unless we change the direction towards conforming to the laws of nature. This year, Chris and I agreed to honor Dr. J. Bhattacharya with the Bridgebuilder Award because he's one of the few who showed great boldness with strong sense of responsibility going against Western governments to manage COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Bhattacharya, along with his two associates, penned a document known as the Great Barrington Declaration. GBD that showed compassion toward the poor, the sick, and seniors, a path to save lives and money. Okay. Dr. Bhattacharya's concern was the suffering of old and poor and the least damage to the fragile economy of developing countries like India. Thousands of workers died in transition due to fatigue and starvation when they were asked to go back to their villages. The release of GDB shattered the notion of consensus favoring the lockdown. Every recommendation of GDB would have helped to manage the pandemic efficiently. To the best of my knowledge, over 135,000 individuals and around 10,000 medical professionals signed approving the resolution when it was published. During the first 4 days, the current count of approval, by my estimate, exceeds 1 million, probably much more. The GBD was penned by authors based on over 100 years of experience managing pandemics. Now, before we invite, I wanted to also add, the starting of the speech was supposed to be, thank you for gracing this event to all of our friends to honor Dr. Bhattacharya, and special thanks to organizers of this wonderful university, LMU. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Robin, and all of LMU team members. And
it is my absolute honor to be here today and to talk to you. I'm grateful in ways I can't even begin to express. It's been difficult actually to get the message I'm going to be giving you out to the public for reasons I'll show you. But more than that, for me, it's been an opportunity to match my lifelong commitment to science with the values that I have, and to have those values be tested, both the scientific values and the human values that I want to tell you about today. Most of the talk is going to be focused on the scientific facts about COVID, and at the end I'll talk briefly about the values I think we all share actually, and then at the end I'm hoping to leave most of the time for questions from the audience, so we can talk about how we have gone through the pandemic, how we've experienced science as a force to sit over us rather than as a force to empower us. Okay, the COVID pandemic was unprecedented in human history. Governments used scientific facts, scientific ideas to control populations in ways that has never happened before. They restricted movements. We, I should say, closed schools. We closed houses of worship. We violated informed consent, privacy rights on a scale that has never before been imagined. And all of this was done in the name of science. It was done in the name of saving lives. The case I'm going to make to you today is that in fact, lives were not actually saved by these policies. And I think even worse and harder is that these policies revealed values about ourselves that I think we really need to look at very carefully, because what it revealed was not very pretty. The values that we say we have, care for the poor, care for the vulnerable, care for the working class, we did not act out. Care for children, we did not act out. In fact, we, in our fear over a disease, violated, I think, every single one of those values. And that's the case I'm going to make today. So let me start with the first bit about how deadly COVID infection is, and this may surprise you. So this was my first sort of entry into COVID science. It's in March of 2020. I had never before written an op-ed. I spent my career publishing papers, and I would get excited when 7 or 8 people would read it. They'd cite it. It'd make me very happy. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal because I had this idea that there was during the H1N1 pandemic, there was the first initial estimates of the deadliness of H1N1 in 2009 was at 3, 4, 5% mortality. And in fact, what happened was that there was a whole series of studies done that I'd been paying close attention to during that pandemic, measuring how widespread the antibodies were in the population. It turns out that during H1N1, there were 100 infections as evidenced by antibodies in your blood per identified case. So the death rate, which was measured based on identified cases, turned out to be 100 times less than the original estimates of the death rate. It wasn't 3%. It turned out to be something on the order of 0.01% death rate. So 99.99% survival from H1N1 flu. It was a much less deadly pandemic than we thought it was going to be. And yet there was still this threat that we used to panic the population. And the first thought I had during COVID was we have a very serious pandemic potentially arising with a very highly infectious disease. Maybe they're actually much more widespread than we thought. Many people with the infection that never showed up in front of for a doctor because they didn't have such a deadly disease. Right? So this pandemic played out exactly that way. Originally, the World Health Organization said that the death rate was 3.4%. If that's true, it truly is a deadly disease, right? Something that we absolutely should be quite concerned about. That doesn't mean we have to lock down, but we need to deploy resources, ingenuity in order to address the threat. Now, I promise no more math after one more slide. And this is the simplest bit of math ever. The case fatality rate, the denominator is how many people come to the attention of doctors, how many people show up in the hospital, how many people are identified with the disease. In the early days of the pandemic, that is actually only a small fraction of the total number of people infected. Why? Because this disease has a very wide range of clinical outcomes. Ranging from the deadly viral pneumonia that riveted our attention in March of 2020 to basically no symptoms whatsoever, and a whole bunch in between. I personally had COVID and I had something in between. Anyway, so cases is the denominator. The numerator is among those people who were identified as a case, how many people died? That's the case fatality rate. That is what the World Health Organization reported. 3.4%. The infection fatality rate looks very much like this, but it's different because it includes all the people who actually were infected, even if they didn't come to the attention of medical professionals. And the question is, how many people are like that? How many people have infections that didn't come to the attention of medical professionals? So I helped organize a study that came out of that Wall Street Journal op-ed I wrote. That Wall Street Journal op-ed led to, believe it or not, somebody, a man who helps run testing for Major League Baseball. He approached me, said, I've ordered a whole bunch of antibody test kits. I was going to use them for Major League Baseball, but I want to use them for science instead. So he handed me the test kits. And we used them to run 2 major studies of antibodies in the population. One in Santa Clara County, California, where I live, and one in LA County, where down here where we are. The Santa Clara County one was published in the International Journal of Epidemiology. I'll just describe that because the results were very similar. In Santa Clara County, at the time we ran the study in April of 2020, there were 1,000 known cases at the time, 1,000 people who'd been identified as having COVID. 100 of them had died, which is a 10% death rate, a tremendously high death rate. When we did the study, it turned out there were 40 to 50 infections per case. For every person that had been identified as having had COVID, 40 people were walking around Santa Clara County that had antibodies that didn't even know they ever had COVID before. They'd had a bad cold. Some of them didn't even have a bad cold. They just had antibodies. And so the case survival rate was 90%. That's a really low case survival rate for a respiratory disease. But the infection survival rate was 99.8%. So 0.2% death rate, infection fatality rate. We published this study from LA County in the Journal of American Medical Association. And I thought what would happen if science works the way it should work is that policy should change. We have a major new finding that recasts how we should think about this virus. It's not a virus that's causing 3.4% mortality. It's a virus that's causing 0.2% mortality in the population at large. There's one other fact, and probably if you need to know one piece of COVID science, what I'm about to tell you next is the most important fact to know. And that is, by the way, I should say, there was now 100 of these studies. It was not just my studies. And now there are 100 of these studies and they find the same exact thing. The infection fatality rate of 0.27%. But here's the most important fact. The death rate varies very substantially by age. If you're over the age of 70, the mortality rate is something like 4 or 5%. If you're over the age of 80, it might be as high as 10%. If you're under the age of 70, the infection fatality rate is 0.05%, 99.5% survival, 99.5% survival for young. And if you're a child, it's very low. This was known from the very first parts of the epidemic. This was a study that was published by my colleague Martin Kulldorff I think he wrote it in February 2020, looking at the Chinese data. There's a 1,000-fold difference in the risk of death from old to young. And so if you're a child, the death rate from this disease is even in March of 2020 was less than the flu. The infection fatality was less than the flu. If you're an older person, it's much higher than the flu. Okay, now you know the most important piece of science that you need to know. Let me tell you some other things that happened as a consequence. So the history of this is we looked at the lockdowns in China. We looked at what was happening in Italy in March of 2020, and I hope everyone still remembers. I'm never going to forget the cathedrals filled with coffins of dead older people, overwhelmed hospital systems, and we got scared. We're honest with ourselves. That's the place from which we made our decisions. We got scared. And we adopted a policy of locking down to suppress the spread of the disease, in order to protect hospital systems. We said, okay, we're going to lock down. The question I want you to be thinking about as I'm going through these slides is, I want you to think, is the protection of hospital systems the right goal for policy? Is that really our value? What should be our value? Our value, to me, our value should be to protect the vulnerable. Protect the old, protect the vulnerable, protect children, protect people who can't protect themselves, right? That as a society, as medicine, as science, it should be used for that purpose. Instead, we adopted a policy, lockdowns, that closed schools, closed businesses, closed houses of worship. We made it a virtue to treat each other as biohazards. So what came out of this policy? And I'm about to show you is it's hard for me to take, but I think we have to look at this squarely in the eye. What the policies we adopted resulted in what I'm going to show you. So the first is poverty. In the last 40 years, there has been an enormous growth there's been an enormous lifting of people out of dire poverty. So economists, when we talk about dire poverty, we say something like less than $2 a day of income. Imagine living on $2 a day of income. Imagine living on less than $2 a day of income. The number of people who live on less than $2 a day of income in 2018 was almost 660 billion. 660 billion. Sorry, 660 million people living below poverty. That's a lot of people. But over the course of the last 40 years, almost almost a billion people have been lifted out of poverty. As of 1991, it was almost 2 billion people living in poverty. It was like enormous success, right? So the poor had become much less poor. My mom grew up in a slum in Kidarpur, in Calcutta, which is a slum called Kidarpur in Calcutta, and that she grew up on $2 a day of less of income. So this is personal to me. That had become much less prevalent. When the lockdowns hit, the World Bank estimated that 100 million people would be thrown into less than $2 a day of income poverty. 100 million people would be thrown in poverty early on in the pandemic as a consequence of the economic dislocation caused by the lockdown on the poor of the world. Naveen Doshi told a story about the Indian lockdown. I want to repeat that story just to give you some sense of what the human effect of these numbers really is. So when India locked down, essentially really because of the same kind of data that I just showed you, the order by the Prime Minister of India was to say that all Indians must go back to their town, that we're going to close down the major cities. Almost 500 million migrant workers live in those cities, and work in those cities, but actually come from elsewhere. Their entire life savings is bound up in it may be a coconuts. Like they buy coconuts for the day, they sell the coconuts, and with the money they buy coconuts for the next day, and then they feed their family with the rest. When the lockdown happened, the cities emptied out. They couldn't sell the coconuts. Their life savings was gone overnight. And they were ordered, these 500 million migrant workers, to go back to their home villages. They went back, some almost 1,000 miles away, by trains, by crowded trains, by buses, bicycles, by foot, many of them. And 1,000 died that day, overnight. Some academics who looked at this call it now the new Trail of Tears. How about the next bit? I could, by the way, I've told about poverty. I could repeat this story in country after country after country, poor country after poor country after poor country. The economic reason for this is we'll talk about it in a bit. Let me talk about hunger. If you live on $2 a day of income, you are at risk of hunger. You are at risk of not going to bed hungry, not being able to get your base food. When the lockdown started, the UN World Food Program estimated that there would be an increase in 130 million people at risk of starvation. Now, why did they say this? Because over the last 40 years, what we've done was we've globalized the world economy. It lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. But what does it mean to do that? Well, poor countries reorganize their economies so that they produce goods that you could sell to the West. They reorganize their economies in ways that relied very heavily on the global economy continuing. When the West decided to shut down, it effectively broke those promises. And millions of people were thrown into unemployment worldwide. Many of those people, as I said, live hand to mouth. And so the projection was that 130 million would starve. There was a very large-scale survey done in February 2021, published in February 2021, looking at a whole bunch of very poor countries. And let me just read you the key thing. Household coping strategies and government assistance were insufficient to sustain pre-crisis living standards, resulting in widespread food insecurity and dire economic conditions even 3 months into the crisis. Okay, now that's a very boring way to say a very dramatic thing, because let me just show you what that actually means. It meant this is a story from July of 2020. I saw this story. I thought, okay, the lockdowns would end because we can't stand. Our societies are not built for this kind of thing. We won't let this happen. The headline: virus-linked hunger tied to 10,000 child deaths each month. It wasn't virus-linked hunger. It was lockdown-linked hunger. In March of 2021, there was a story in the BBC based on a UN report that's found that 228,000 children had died in South Asia alone from hunger and from missed vaccinations, mostly hunger. This should have ended all talk of lockdown because you can see the inhumanity of it. Let me talk, I mentioned childhood vaccinations. Childhood vaccinations are critically important for the health and well-being of children everywhere. Diseases like polio, measles have killed tremendous numbers of people, and the vaccines that have been used to prevent them are quite effective at doing so. Very early in the pandemic, in May of 2020, World Health Organization warned that 80 million children were at risk of a disease like diphtheria, measles, and polio, as COVID-19, they say the virus disrupts routine vaccination. But of course, it's not the virus that disrupted routine vaccinations. It was a decision by medical authorities that routine vaccinations were no longer so important. COVID-19 was very far from the worst threat to the lives of children worldwide. As I showed you, they're very low risk of dying from COVID. On the other hand, as polio spreads, and polio actually we've been on the verge of eradicating. If polio spreads, children are at risk. If diphtheria spreads, children are at risk. If measles spreads, it's children that are at risk. And in fact, this is what happened. In October 2020, there was a story of preventing vaccine preventable diseases during the pandemic. Let me read this to you. Global health organizations have been faced with an impossible choice. One, continue vaccination campaigns, that is for polio, diphtheria, and so on, while putting frontline workers and families at risk of contracting COVID-19. Or two, halt mass vaccination campaigns in their entirety, leaving countless children at risk of vaccine preventable diseases. Many global vaccination campaigns chose the second option. They chose fear over the protection of vulnerable children. On March 24, 2020, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative recommended suspension of polio vaccinations campaigns around the world and committed to making its programmatic and operational assets and emergency operations centers available to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. We prioritize COVID-19 over the diseases that actually kill children. And it's not a surprise that polio has now shown up in New York City wastewater. Schooling, we close schools. Let me show you a study from early on in the pandemic. Actually, I'll show that in a second. Let me tell you about a study in early on in the pandemic. In Iceland, there was a study conducted in April of 2020, where they found 10% of the population, sampled 10% of the population, found everybody who had COVID disease. And they did a very careful contact tracing study married to a genetic sequencing. The nice thing about the genetic sequencing of the virus is that you can tell who passed the virus to who, right? So if I have a virus with a mutation A and B, and another person has virus with mutation A but not B, then the directionality, I probably didn't pass the virus to the other person because that doesn't have mutation B, but he might have passed the virus to me. In that study, not one child was found passing the disease on to a parent. It was always the other direction. This is not like other infectious diseases, other respiratory diseases, where it's quite common for children to pass the virus to parents. The children can pass the virus to parents, that's true, but they are less efficient spreaders of the disease than parents, than adults are. On that basis, places like Sweden decided to keep their schools open for the entire pandemic with no social distancing, no restrictions, no masks. And the result was no dead children from COVID in spring of 2020, and teachers who had COVID rate at lower rates than the rest of the population. the children, by being around children, they were protected from COVID. Many other places, California included, decided to close schools instead, ignoring the evidence. In poor countries like Uganda, this is a picture of three Ugandan boys. Uganda closed schools for 2 years, 2 full years. Out of 15 million children in Uganda going to schools, 4.5 million never came back to school and will never come back to school. Many of them, especially girls, many were sold into sexual slavery instead because their parents couldn't afford to care for them. This was essentially a generational theft because these kids are going to grow up poor and many of them will die earlier than they ought to have. In the Philippines, the same story. Some children in the Philippines never saw the outside of their house for 2 full years. In the US, in November 2020, the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics did an estimate of how many life years we cost American children as a consequence of the school closures. Now, let me explain how that works. There's a whole bunch of studies that have been done before the pandemic looking to measure how good an investment it is to educate a child. They would use these natural experiments, for instance, where one state would would have mandate being in school from up to age 17, another up to age 16. And it turns out that when you switch from 16 to 17, force kids to be in school up until age 17, those kids that are in the state that mandates up to age 17, those kids lead longer lives, healthier lives, and are less likely to be poor and unemployed through their entire life. Schooling is probably the single most important investment we make as a society. And we decided to stop it. And so what these authors did is they looked and asked, okay, we closed schools for 3 months. What effect is it likely to have on the lives of our children over the next decades in terms of their health? Here's the estimate. The decision analytic model found that missed instruction during spring 2020, could be associated with an estimated 13.8 million life years lost based on data from US studies, and an estimated 0.8 million life years lost based on data from European studies. This estimated loss of life expectancy was to be greater than would have been observed if leaving primary schools open had led to an expansion in the first wave of the pandemic. In other words, we cost our children more life years than you likely saved from the lockdowns. So just to be clear, what we did, we took the lives, shortened the lives of our children so that we, the adults, could, we thought, live longer. The cost of the children over their lifetime is something on the order of $17 trillion. This is generational theft. And it's not evenly distributed in the population. It's Black and Hispanic and poor populations who had the worst schooling deprivation. I still remember, and I will never forget for the rest of my life, a picture in the San Jose Mercury News in May of 2020 of 2 children, 2 Hispanic children, sitting outside of a 7-Eleven where there was a, I think it was a 7-Eleven, it might have been a Taco Bell actually, where their parents had left them with the Google books because they didn't have internet at home. Again, a picture that should have ended the lockdowns, that should have opened schools, but didn't. It's poor children, minority children that face the brunt of this, the longest time away. Whereas more well-off children could go to private schools that actually met in person, that actually had sort of more education. Were schools safe to reopen? I showed you that estimate that Europe had less harm to their children from schooling. Why? Because Europe actually responded to the evidence that schools were safe and they opened their schools. Sweden, I already told you, opened their schools entirely. But Sweden wasn't the only one. This is the Icelandic estimate. I'm just going to run through this very fast just to get you some sense. But the Netherlands opened their schools. in the fall. France opened their schools. Now, many of these places closed for short periods of time when there was high spread, but then reopened shortly after. Ireland, Germany, which is still COVID scared, still had their schools open, many of them. Japan, South Korea, the UK, pupils posed little risk of spreading COVID from the UK. Europe was much more compassionate about its kids than America was, especially Blue America. There was a study done in the US, in Wisconsin, where the study authors just wanted to ask can we open schools without spreading in the community? And the CDC actually published this study, but nevertheless, schools stayed closed in the United States, especially in blue counties. What about non-health priorities? I've talked about the poor, children. What about the sick and the vulnerable? Well, we hurt them too. In the early days of the pandemic, people stayed home with heart attacks and died at home. People with diabetes who really do need careful management of their blood glucose, or else they face risks of kidney failure, heart disease, stroke. Well, we stopped doing that. We decided that COVID was a bigger risk than cancer. So women will show up now with breast cancer at later stages and die from breast cancer that should have been picked up earlier and their lives saved. Men and women will show up with colon cancer that should have been picked up earlier and will die from colon cancer that should have been picked up at earlier stages. COVID is a deadly disease for the old, but there are many threats to human health, and health is not simply the absence of one single infectious disease. This is a study from the CDC in July of 2020. It was published in July of 2020. It's a nationwide study of mental health. And one of the questions that was asked is did you think about killing yourself last month? Did you think about killing yourself last month? The report showed that in July of 2020, 1 in 4 young adults in the United States seriously considered suicide the previous month. The anxiety and despair was greater in young. It was all across the board, but really among the young, especially young adults, we created this sense of despair and anxiety such that 1 in 4 seriously considered suicide. TB risks, tuberculosis is a much more deadly disease than COVID, and it threatens the lives of the poorest people around the world. We stopped treating tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, in order to treat it, you have to get regular antibiotics for a year or more. And if you don't get it, then it actually can be quite deadly, and it spreads very, very easily. If you treat it, you can prevent the worst of it, prevent it from spreading. Disruptions in the services for TB in the COVID-19 pandemic have led to further setbacks. In many countries, human, financial, and other resources have been reallocated from TB to the COVID-19 response. According to the new report, data collected from 200 countries has shown a significant reductions in TB case notifications, with 25% to 30% drops reported in 3 high-burden countries: India, Indonesia, and Philippines. Let me describe what happened here. People stopped reporting TB, not because there was less TB, but because we just weren't looking for it anymore. And that means we weren't treating it anymore. So let me ask, what did we get for this? And so let me show you what the evidence is, whether the lockdowns actually worked to stop the spread of the disease. They actually worked to protect populations. And unfortunately, the answer is no. In 2021, I did a study with John Ioannidis and Aaron Ben David and Christopher O, where we compared the Swedish and South Korean experience early in the pandemic. They did not actually have a shelter-in-place order against countries that actually had a shelter-in-place order. And what we found was that while small benefits couldn't be excluded, we found no significant benefits of case growth of shelter-in-place orders. Why is that? Why did it not work? It turns out that only about 20 or 30% of the population of the United States can actually afford to stay home and stay safe. Most of the people actually have to work. Most people actually have to go out and feed their families. you order a shelter in place. Well, if you happen to have a job, I mean, I'm lucky. I had a job where I could replace it with Zoom. I didn't lose my job as a consequence. Although I'm sure Stanford University would have been, very happy to have me go. I think in that sense, I'm very lucky. Most of the population isn't like that. If you skip your job, you actually you get fired. Now there were policies to try to replace the income and try to blunt that, but those policies have had negative consequences. And for many families, especially, like imagine a single mom with a second grader. There's Zoom school, and she has to face a choice. Do I stay home with my son with second grader, or do I go to work so I can feed him? A lot of single parents were faced with that. There's now a whole series of studies that have been done on the effects of these shelter-in-place orders. And there's two kinds of studies that have been done. One set of studies have used these modeling exercises that are incredibly naive about the basic realities of society. How poor people really have, what resources do they have? Can they actually shelter in place? And what these studies routinely find is they'll project enormous case growth if you don't lock down, the green line. And they'll say, well, look, if we don't lock down, and then the blue line, the middle line is what case growth you'd get if you did lock down. And the difference between the two is how many lives are saved by the lockdown based on some model. When in fact, the reality looks like the blue line at the bottom. You see that? The models have routinely been mistaken in and overestimated the number of lives saved by lockdowns. Instead, there's the second set of studies that did what I just showed you, comparing real world places that locked down, comparing against similar places that didn't, and asked how many lives were saved. And when a group at Johns Hopkins analyzed these, what they found was that the average lockdown in 2020 had reduced COVID mortality by about 23,000 avoided deaths in Europe and 16,000 deaths in the United States. Right? So lockdowns did save lives, but a small number of them. It didn't save lives forever. What it did is it delayed when you got COVID. You didn't get it in March of 2020, you got it in January of 2022. The results of our meta-analysis, according to not mine, the Hopkins meta-analysis, support the conclusion that lockdowns in the spring of 2020 had little to no effect on COVID mortality, because shifting cases from earlier to later doesn't really save lives. The key thing is, to understand why this didn't work, is because lockdowns are a luxury of the laptop class. I call it trickle-down epidemiology. You protect everyone by protecting the rich, right? And so this describes what you have is you have a man sitting with his wine, grilling his burger, looking up at the poor living in this apartment complex who are staring at him, masked and wanting to go outside. What part of social distancing do you people not understand? This is the ethic of the lockdown. In Toronto, in the early days of the pandemic, the 30 poorest neighborhoods, that's the gray line, you can see the spread of the disease there. The blue line is the 30 richest neighborhoods. The lockdown protected the 30 richest neighborhoods from COVID, while COVID spread through the 30 poorest. The same happened in Los Angeles. If you look in the places in Los Angeles where the poor live, COVID spread. In the richest neighborhoods, it didn't. In the early in the pandemic, it eventually went to the richest neighborhoods too. By the way, just took a couple of years. The idea of the lockdown was focused protection of the laptop class, people who could afford. And in fact, I've often thought about what happened in 2009. Why didn't we lock down then? Zoom caused the lockdown. Zoom caused the lockdown. We locked down. We locked down because we had a technology that could protect the laptop class now, and we didn't have it back then in 2009. Skype just wasn't good enough. Let me talk about vaccine passports, because I think this is another aspect of how we used a fantastic technology, something that could be used to protect people and were used to protect people, but instead also used it to create an underclass, to create a distinction between clean and unclean. So first, a couple bits of science. First bit of science. This is a study from Qatar, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The key thing about this study is that after about 4 months after you've been fully vaccinated, you're no longer really protected against getting infected. So I was vaccinated in April of 2021, and in August of 2021, 4 months later, I got COVID. Anyone else get COVID after they were vaccinated? See the arms in the room? A few of us. A lot of people actually got COVID after they were vaccinated. Everyone did, right? It's because that doesn't stop transmission. It doesn't protect. Now, on the other hand, it does reduce the likelihood of severe disease and death. It's a really effective, it's incredible how effective it is for a long period of time against severe disease and death. Now, it doesn't work forever. Now, on the basis of that, can you say that if you're in a room full of unvaccinated people, that you're at high risk of getting COVID versus being in a room full of vaccinated people? Is there a difference? It's a material difference. Yeah, it's really not that big, especially if the unvaccinated people have already had COVID and recovered. That provides pretty strong immunity against both infection and also severe disease and death. In fact, there's a whole bunch of studies. Don't squint and read them, but they're from Israel, from Lombardy, from Iceland again, that shows that if you've had COVID and recovered, you have a pretty good protection against reinfection until there's a new variant. And if you do get infected again, you are protected against severe disease and death. So both the vaccine and and recovery from old COVID protects you against severe disease and death. Both the vaccine and recovery from COVID still allows you to get COVID again at some point. This is just like the other coronaviruses, where you can get reinfected, but it doesn't produce severe disease and death the second, third, fourth time you get it. So you have long-lasting immunity. You have a vaccine that provides personal protection, but that doesn't provide communal protection. What do you do with those facts? Do you discriminate against the unvaccinated? Do you treat them like second-class citizens? That's what we did. We created a two-class society, right? With an underclass deprived of basic rights to leave home, enter civic spaces. In some countries, we still, in the United States, prevent unvaccinated foreigners from entering. Vaccine mandates, I think, violated basic principles of medical ethics, including informed consent and privacy. Okay, I'm going to end with the Great Barrington Declaration and I'll let Aaron speak. The Great Barrington Declaration, we wrote it in October of 2020. We, meaning being Sinetro Group, that was the world's best infectious disease epidemiologist, who's responsible for a tremendous number of advances, including potentially a universal flu vaccine that might comes out of her ideas. And Martin Kulldorff on the right, who's then a professor at Harvard University in biostatistics and epidemiology. He developed the key statistical tools that are used to track vaccine safety and to identify outbreaks early, including, for instance, an outbreak in 2015 of Legionnaire's disease in New York City was stopped by his ideas. We wrote this in October of 2020, and it was signed by now 15,000 medical scientists, 50,000 medical practitioners, almost 1 million people. Anyone else sign it in the room? There's a few. Oh, look at that, the signature. Thank you all. The key idea was focused protection of the vulnerable. And who's vulnerable? Well, at least older people. Some people with chronic disease, but primarily older people. I showed you the evidence from that earlier on. Better protection of the old. At the same time, for younger people, the lockdowns are deeply unethical. We harm them with this idea that restricting their lives to protect older people. But why not just directly protect older people? Let children go to school. What could you do to protect older people? Well, in the early days of the pandemic, we sent COVID-infected patients into nursing homes. That's the opposite of focused protection. Why did we do that? We did that because we thought that it was hospital systems that needed protection, not old people. If instead we paid attention to the scientific facts about the virus and also maintained our values, which is protection of people over systems, we would never have sent COVID-infected patients back to hospitals, back to nursing homes. We would have moved heaven and earth to protect older people. We would have, for instance, one of the problems in nursing homes is that you have staff that work in multiple nursing homes, leave one nursing home, go into another. We would have reduced staff rotations in nursing homes. We might have even made it into a place where staff would have to might stay for two months, 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, so that to reduce the traffic in and out. We could have done that as a pandemic, and we could have given them hazard pay. We spent $6 trillion on a lot of other things. We could have organized communities to provide food for older people during terms of high spread. We could have said, asked younger people to go shopping for older people. We could have in LA, we offered hotels for young homeless people who actually weren't at particularly high risk, believe it or not, for COVID. We could have also offered those hotel rooms to older people living in multi-generational homes, so that when Johnny calls up grandma, I think I've been exposed to COVID. Grandma calls local public health, says, I think my grandson's been exposed to COVID. Local public health offers a hotel room for 2 or 3 days until Johnny's clear of COVID. Right? We could have used all of our ingenuity and resources to protect older people against COVID. This would have looked very different here than it would have looked in Billings, Montana, for instance. But local public health knows how the living circumstances of the population could have used this ingenuity to protect the old. Instead, we used our ingenuity to make people wear masks. Instead, we used our ingenuity to close schools, close businesses. We even arrested a paddleboarder, I think, down the street. The vaccines are actually a tremendously important tool for focused protection. In Sweden, it was actually a delayed rollout of the vaccines. And but what they did is they systematically used every dose in an older person. And so what we're seeing above at the top is this wave of cases that happened in late 2020 in Sweden, and then the wave of cases that happened in spring of 2021 in Sweden. 2 major waves of cases. The bottom is deaths from COVID. The second wave did not produce deaths because Sweden systematically vaccinated its older population. And so it decoupled deaths from cases. Now, the thing is that the United States and California were actually quite delayed, especially California. My mom lives in LA County, didn't get her vaccines until March of 2021. We were quite slow actually in getting the vaccines out. And we had, we didn't have the same kind of decoupling that Sweden had. These ideas of the Great Barrington Declaration: focus protection of the vulnerable, open up the rest of the world so that we don't harm people, like children, for instance, was met with, rather than, now these are old ideas. These are not ideas actually that are original to me. These are ideas that we've used to manage respiratory pandemics for a century. Let me show you what was meant with. So when we published them on October 4, 2020, 4 days after we wrote it, this man is Francis Collins, the head of the National Institute of Health. 4 days after we wrote it, on October 8th, 2020, he wrote an email to Tony Fauci, the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, who works for him. He wrote, "Hi, Tony and Cliff." Cliff is another NIH employee. "Please see the Great Barrington Declaration. The proposal from 3 fringe epidemiologists." That's me, I think. I got a business card somewhere that says fringe epidemiology on it. So I had it. Who met with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, seems to be getting a lot of attention. That's 4 days after we wrote it. Even a co-signature from a Nobel Prize winner, Mike Levitt, who's a friend of mine at Stanford. There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway? Tony Fauci responded. Then Francis Collins gave us an interview with the Washington Post where he accused me of wanting to let the virus rip through the population. What I was arguing for was focused protection. Tony Fauci wrote to Francis Collins, says, meaning the White House, is too busy with other things to worry about this. What you said was entirely correct. Francis Collins responded, my quotes are accurate, but will not be appreciated by the White House. To them, it was a political thing. How do I manage the White House? It was not a scientific or moral thing. How do I protect vulnerable people? So okay, I already showed you these. The key thing that happened here was that the scientific bureaucracy of the United States and the world, actually, the Western world, wanted to create an illusion that there was a consensus in favor of lockdown, when in fact there were many of us fringe people who didn't want a lockdown, who thought the lockdown was the wrong way to address the pandemic. I'm going to stop with one reform idea, and the reform idea is this: you have scientific funders who control which scientists will succeed and fail in their careers. I have a 10-year position at the Stanford School of Medicine. I wouldn't have had it if I didn't have NIH grants. The NIH grants are not just money, but a signifier of success that confers social status within science. Many scientists stayed silent because they were afraid of being accused of being fringe. I'd never understood this before the pandemic, but I now understand it deeply. There's a deep conflict of interest between scientific funding and science policy. When scientific funders take a position on science policy, it is very difficult for scientists to speak up in opposition. And so I love this. I've replaced what it used to say with this. I put science on one side and science bureaucrats on the other. It's a very simple reform idea. We would have had a much more robust debate if there was a bright, firm line, not between science and the church, but between science and science bureaucrats. Let the science bureaucrats fund scientific projects, but let's not have them involved in science policy. So I'm going to end, but if you want to stay involved, I've helped found 3 organizations: the Brownstone Institute, where we publish a lot of essays about the harms from lockdowns; the Collateral Global, which is a charity in the UK, where we're trying to organize the literature on lockdown harms and lockdown effects; and then the Academy for Science and Freedom, where we're trying to reform how science functions. So when there's another pandemic, science functions much better in consonant with the values of society, rather than being above the values of society, dictating society as it has during the pandemic. Thank you very much.
So I want to begin by thanking again Dean Crabtree, Professor Chappell, Mr. and Mrs. Doshi for your hospitality, and to LMU for giving us an opportunity to have this conversation, which has been a difficult one to have during the pandemic, and for reasons that Jay already described. It's been hard for people that have differences of opinion on COVID policy to stand up in a place like this in an academic context and have a meaningful discussion about it. It's been very hard for us to criticize pandemic policies that were favored by the ruling class or by the government. So I'm not going to talk really about myself, but just 1 or 2 lines to give you some background on where I'm coming from. So I was at UCI School of Medicine, a professor in the School of Medicine Department of Psychiatry, where I also served as director of the medical ethics program. So I was there for 15 years, basically my entire career since residency training. And I was deeply involved in pandemic policies. So our vaccine allocation policy, where I advocated, give it to the old people first, not to the people who are on the front lines, because I knew the science about risk. But then when our university published its vaccine mandate, the work group that I was involved in that had that had drafted all the other pandemic policies was not consulted. And I found that very puzzling. And I also found the vaccine mandate to run contrary to the medical ethics principles that I had taught students for many years. So I likewise published a piece in the Wall Street Journal in early 2021, basically arguing that university vaccine mandates violated basic principles of medical ethics. UC went forward with its vaccine mandate. I ended up challenging that mandate in federal court on constitutional grounds. That case is still in federal court in the Ninth Circuit. In response to my legal challenge, the university fired me last December. So I'm now in private practice, but still making trouble. But it's a great honor to be here, mostly because of just the regard that I have for what Professor Bhattacharya and his colleagues, Mark Koldorf and Dr. Gupta, did during the pandemic, which helped to orient me, because I was thinking all of the things that they eventually published in the Great Barrington Declaration, but I didn't know how to articulate it. My background was not so much in public health and epidemiology, more in medical ethics as it applies in a clinical context, difficult cases at the bedside and so forth. But what I want to do in my 10 or 15 minutes of commentary on Jay's presentation is to sort of Google Earth up and try to provide a broader historical, social, and political context to understand what happened during lockdowns. Because I think that broader context and trying to situate this historically is one of the things that we have not yet done and have not yet come to terms with. From the lepers of the Old Testament to the plague of Justinian in ancient Rome, which some historians believe played a major role in the fall of the Roman Empire, to the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, COVID represented the first time ever in the history of managing pandemics that we locked down, that we quarantined healthy populations. And there was an effort to conflate lockdowns with earlier methods of quarantine that I think are either historically misinformed or disingenuous. While the ancients didn't understand the mechanisms of infectious disease, they obviously knew nothing about viruses and bacteria in ancient times. They nevertheless figured out many ways to mitigate the spread of contagion during epidemics. Time-tested measures range from isolating symptomatic individuals to sometimes closing the gates or locking the borders of walled cities to avoid people coming in and out, to having people who had recovered from the illness and had natural immunity caring for the sick because they were less likely to get sick and less likely to spread the illness. Lockdowns were never a part of conventional public health measures. Jay alluded to this, but I want to make this clear from a very broad historical perspective. We didn't do this before 2020. I believe we didn't do it because it doesn't work. And hopefully you're either convinced of that or at least more skeptical of the notion that it was effective. There was an article published in the New York Times very early on when the White House basically decided that lockdowns were the way to go. This is in February of 2020, where the Times lead science reporter, a man named Donald McNeil, basically made the argument in the New York Times pages and the podcast that was published the day before that civil liberties would have to be suspended if we were going to get a handle on COVID and avoid massive casualties. And the headline of his article was, "To take on the coronavirus, go medieval on it." The article didn't give enough credit to medieval society, which, as I said, sometimes locked the gates of walled city or quarantined sick people who were symptomatic, but never ordered people to stay in their homes, never stopped people from plying their trades, right? The blacksmith could still go into his workshop and make a living, and never isolated asymptomatic individuals. So no, the lockdowns were not a medieval throwback. They were an entirely modern invention, wholly untested on actual human populations and based, as Dr. Bhattacharya suggested, entirely on computer modeling. Alexis de Tocqueville, that great commentator on democracy in America, warned us that democratic institutions and nations contain some built-in vulnerabilities that can lead even open democratic societies to deteriorate into despotism under certain conditions. I would suggest that new levels of political irresponsibility in Europe and America came when we took an authoritarian communist state as the model for managing the pandemic. The origin of lockdowns was Wuhan, China. And the first advocates of the lockdown model were the Chinese Communist Party, at least at the political level. The CCP convinced Western nations that they had stamped out COVID in Wuhan and surrounding regions by a very stringent lockdown. This was utterly false advertising. And if you've been paying attention to the more recent kind of horrifying lockdowns in Shanghai, you know that this was not true. But Italy bought it. After Italy locked down, the US locked down shortly thereafter. And once the US locked down, basically virtually every country in the world followed suit, including poor nations that were in no shape to try to do this to their population. Within weeks, the whole world was locked down. It's one of the fascinating things about COVID was just how global and uniform the response was, with very few, with a few notable exceptions here and there, but for the most part, very few countries that took radically different approaches. So the first thing I want to impress upon you is just the sheer novelty of what happened in March of 2020 around the world. We were introduced, I would suggest, not just to new and previously untested methods of trying to control an infection. More than this, we embraced a wholly new paradigm for society, a paradigm that had actually been decades in the making, that goes back to probably the year 2001, but had never actually been tried prior to 2020. What descended on us was not just a novel virus, but a new method of social control, what I have called the biomedical security state, our quote unquote new abnormal. Biomedical security state involves a kind of unholy welding or melding of three things. The first is public health. The second is digital methods of surveillance and control that were used, for example, with vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. And the third is the police powers of the state, right? The guy out on his paddleboard who actually gets arrested because he's not following public health orders. The term lockdown itself originated not in medicine, but in the penal system, right? The most highly surveilled and controlled setting on the planet goes into lockdown when there's a riot, when there's complete chaos and violence erupting. A stringent response is necessary to restore order. This biosecurity paradigm began to emerge about 20 years ago, around the year 2001, in the wake of the September 11th attacks, the anniversary of which we just observed the other day. Prior to that, biomedical security, paying attention to threats either from man-made or naturally occurring viruses, was sort of a marginal part of international relations. It was a marginal part of national defense, right? There was not a lot of talk prior to September 11th of needing a massive infrastructure to deal with a biological attack, for example. It assumed a more central role in political strategies and calculations following 9/11. 4 years later, already back in 2005, for example, the WHO, World Health Organization, grossly overpredicted that the avian influenza, the bird flu, would kill somewhere between 2 and 50 million people. To prevent this impending disaster, the WHO actually made a recommendation back in 2005 that no nation was politically prepared to accept at the time, and probably were not technologically prepared to try. Which included the proposal of population-wide lockdowns. So this notion had been floated in public health by 2005. Even earlier, back in 2001, a man named Richard Hatchett, who was a member of the CIA, also served on George W. Bush's National Security Council, was already recommending obligatory confinement for the entire population in response to potential biological threats. Dr. Hatchett is still around. In fact, he's directing something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations, CEPI, which is an influential entity coordinating vaccine investment. It collaborates with the pharmaceutical industry, the World Economic Forum, and the Gates Foundation. Like many other public health officials today, Hatchett regards the fight against COVID-19 as a war analogous to the war on terror. And with war and a wartime response, it's all hands on deck. It's commandeering the entire population to move in the same direction because the threat to us is existential, right? Although proposals for lockdowns were circulating by 2005 and even a little bit earlier in some circles of national security and CIA and so forth, as I said, we didn't embrace this until 2020. At which point we adopted a paradigm that had three basic components to it. Again, what I've called the biomedical security paradigm, three basic characteristics. Number one, we formulate public health measures based on possible risks in hypothetical scenarios, computer models, with data presented to promote behavior that would be required to manage a really extreme situation, right? So we present, and this is the second feature, we present sort of worst case logic as key to our approach, a key element of political rationality. And as a consequence of these two things, number three, we need a systematic organization of the entire body of citizens to reinforce adhesion to government regulations and government institutions. Try to dissent from what's being recommended by public health officials, and it could cost you your job, or it certainly would cost you your reputation. You'll become, you go from being a Stanford professor to a quote unquote fringe epidemiologist. Well, this is precisely what happened in early 2020. Number one, lockdowns were formulated on the basis of worst case scenario modeling. The model used was from the Imperial College in London. This failed model predicted 2.2 million immediate deaths in the United States within months if we did not lock down. And consequently, number three, the entire body of citizens as a manifestation of civic spirit, right? Nobody wants to kill grandma. We gave up rights and freedoms that were not relinquished, for example, even by the citizens of London during the bombing of the city in World War II. London had curfews, but never locked down during the German raids. The biomedical security state has proven to be far more effective at controlling populations than anything previously attempted by Western nations. Jay alluded to this at the beginning of his lecture, but again, I think it's important to try to put what happened to us in context. Many of us are still sort of shell-shocked from what happened. And so let's stand back and get some critical distance from it and try to understand it. Under this regime, the total cessation of every form of political activity and social relationship became the ultimate act of civic participation. Do your duty as a citizen by completely withholding yourself from public life. It's a very strange kind of contradiction. Neither the pre-war fascist government in Italy under Mussolini, nor the communist nations after World War II ever dreamed of implementing the kind of restrictions that we saw during COVID. I think it's helpful to reflect on the term social distancing, which is not really a medical term. A medical or scientific paradigm would have perhaps deployed a term like physical distancing or personal distancing, but not social distancing. The word suggests that this is a new model for society, a new model for social relationships, one that limits them by 6 feet of space and a mask that covers the face, which is our very locus of interpersonal communication and connection. The 6 foot or 2 meter distancing rule was premised on the idea that was promoted early on that COVID was spread through respiratory droplets, right? When you cough or you sneeze, it could land on someone and be a source of contagion. But one of the things that puzzled me very early on is even when it became clear that COVID was not spread by that method, it was spread through aerosolized mechanisms, we still continued the 6 foot, there were things on the ground showing us where we could stand, or in the corners of elevators. One of my favorite pictures of the pandemic is 4 people standing at 4 corners of the elevator, all facing the corner like this. That won't stop the spread of COVID, right? The total number of people in the room and the total time spent in the room will determine contagion. So rather than putting up plastic barriers everywhere, which impede ventilation, we should have opened all the windows or held class outside if there were vulnerable populations that we were trying to protect. So we were doing all kinds of crazy things that didn't make epidemiological or scientific sense, which suggests to me that they served some other social or political function. The myth of asymptomatic spread was another element that was debunked early on scientifically, but that never sort of translated into public health recommendations or what most people thought they knew about COVID. So the idea that every other person out there is a potential threat to my existence, even if they're not exhibiting any symptoms. It would be hard to devise a better method than this myth of asymptomatic spread, combined with the practice of confining, quarantining healthy people, to destroy the fabric of society and to divide us. And if we look around now, regardless of what we think about the policies or what we think about what happened during COVID or which sides of these debates we might land on, I think all of us can agree that there are deep social divisions. There were deep social divisions prior to the pandemic, obviously politically and socially and culturally and ethically and so forth. But I think we're certainly worse off now than we were 3 years ago. Even families, deeply divided over COVID policy that impacted Thanksgiving gatherings, that impacted, whether or not someone could see their nephew or their niece for 3 years and so forth. In those dizzying early days of 2020, I would suggest we lived through the swift and sustained abolition of public spaces and the squeezing even of private ones. Physical human presence was confined to the enclosure of domestic walls, and even that was discouraged at times. You'll remember our governor and our president discouraging family Thanksgiving gatherings, for example. I think it's important to consider, and certainly I think the context of this lecture with the support of the bridge building program, the Department of Theology, is very important to consider the human and spiritual goods that were sacrificed in what I think Professor Bhattacharya regard as a failed attempt to manage the virus. Friendships, holidays with family, work, visiting and providing spiritual care to the sick and the dying, worshiping God, practicing communal rites of religion and worship, even burying the dead. And by burying the dead, I don't just mean going to a funeral. I mean, literally, there was a few months early on in the pandemic where hospitals would not return the body of a deceased person, if he or she died of COVID, to the family for burial. The body was cremated before the remains were returned, even if the person was requesting not cremation, but let's say a traditional Christian burial. Recall one family at UC Irvine that I was consulted on as the ethicist, where this would, we had to first of all help them come to terms with the fact that their loved one was irretrievably dying of COVID, which was hard enough. And then when they asked for help with the funeral arrangements, the social worker informed them that because of some theoretical risk of that maybe a dead body could spread COVID, a notion that we had no scientific evidence for, and no evidence from the history of respiratory illnesses to believe it might be a risk. on the basis of this theoretical biological risk, a real present known human and spiritual good was sacrificed, right? So there was this very strange reversal of values that occurred. Dr. Bhattacharya, and I'll close with just a couple of last remarks on the effects on individuals in terms of loneliness that the lockdown policies created. Loneliness and social fragmentation were endemic in the West, even prior to coronavirus in 2019. In fact, our Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, was talking in 2018 about this epidemic of loneliness and comparing the adverse health effects of loneliness to the effects of smoking and heart disease. Two researchers, one of whom was awarded the Nobel Prize, Ann Case and Angus Deaton at Princeton, had demonstrated that these factors were contributing to rising what are called deaths of despair, death by suicide, alcohol and drug-related illnesses. So this was an epidemic prior to the pandemic. And the pandemic threw gasoline on that fire. We could get into the statistics on that during the Q&A if people are interested, but we saw a massive rise last year in drug and alcohol related deaths on top of a situation where that was already a national crisis. This shouldn't have surprised us. Loneliness can kill every bit as much as a virus can kill. And it can kill people that are vulnerable to the virus too. So the idea that isolating elderly people who have a higher risk of fatality from COVID is going to improve their risk of dying, well, that's a complicated question. It's a question that at least requires debate and discussion and a more careful look at the evidence. It's no accident that one of the most severe punishments we can inflict on prisoners is solitary confinement. It's a condition that eventually will lead, if it lasts long enough, to sensory disintegration and psychosis. People lose their minds when we're hardwired to connect with other human beings. And we really can't function. And literally we can't live without those connections for prolonged periods of time. I think this is something that most of I would say all of the great religious traditions in the world, both East and West, recognize that need for deep connection with other people and deep connection to the transcendent or to God. So with that, I'm going to close my remarks and thank you again for the invitation to comment on Professor Bhattacharya's presentation.
Okay, I'm going to pose some, if I could have the questions here, that would be great. Oh my goodness. Okay, we will get through some of these and not all of them. But what is the most important local civic action we can take to protect the most vulnerable in our communities?
I mean, I think it varied during the course of the pandemic. Once the vaccines became available, encouraging older people to be vaccinated was the most important thing one could do. I think now the set of vulnerable people have really changed. For COVID, of course, it's still older people, but a lot of older people, the vast majority of them have either had COVID and recovered or have had the vaccine or both. The most vulnerable people now in the communities are the people who've been harmed by the lockdowns, children who have just 2 years of disrupted lives, poor people who've lost their capacity for their livelihood. The set of people who we thought of as marginal and vulnerable before the pandemic are now, I think, among the most vulnerable still, with a situation that's been made much worse by the lockdowns. I think we need to remember that COVID is not the most important thing on Earth. That human societies face so many harms and so many challenges, and refocus on that. And I think that's the best way to protect the vulnerable at this point.
We should also be encouraging health promoting behaviors, not just, staying away from the virus at all costs. It's very, very, very hard. I would argue impossible to avoid exposure to COVID. It's just too contagious. So one of the questions for people that would be vulnerable, particularly the elderly, is what can I do to strengthen my resilience against this virus? Weight loss, particularly for those who are obese. There's some good studies on vitamin D levels. Make sure your vitamin D level is up. Physical activity, good sleep, all the standard health promoting behaviors that have a beneficial effect on the immune system. I think we need to be talking more about that and giving people back a sense of agency that they're not going to be a helpless victim of this scary, invisible pathogen that we can't control, but that there are things that you could do to improve your overall health and some specific things to do to improve your immune system that won't eradicate your risk if you get the virus, but will lower your risk. And I think that's an empowering message that was not sufficiently advocated during the pandemic.
More thought about this. Resumption of social life. That what Dr. Cariati said about loneliness is entirely true. It is a killer. In fact, in the UK, they have a minister of loneliness to address the problem of loneliness. There was a huge increase, especially among the elderly, in deaths from loneliness and isolation. And so I think let's start meeting again with each other. Let's enjoy each other's company once again.
Another question. Do you think, or if COVID cases start to go up a whole bunch, what would you do?
So cases are not that important. Okay, what we have to pay attention to are hospitalizations and deaths. As Dr. Bhattacharya pointed out, a case may be someone who has few to no symptoms. And if you're asymptomatic, you're not likely to spread it. You are building up immunity to it, which is a good thing. And that's also contributing to herd immunity. And so the more people get exposed to new variants, the less likely it is that infections are going to prove fatal. So I think we should sort of stop the obsession with cases and focus on the bad outcomes. And if you look at that, it's much easier to see progress. We have to accept that this is endemic. This virus is never going away, which doesn't have to be a scary thing, because if you're exposed to it early in life and re-exposed to it many times during life, you're probably not going to be very vulnerable when you're old. You're going to have robust natural immunity. What we have now is a situation where we have an elderly population that was not exposed to it when they were young. And so that's the population that Jay was advocating, that we do more to protect. We have to continue doing that. But when influenza kills tens of thousands of people every year in a good year, including and especially elderly people or people that have pulmonary conditions, we've learned to live with it. We don't talk about each new flu season as a scary new wave with a scary new variant of influenza, even though that's kind of what there is a new variant of influenza every year, and it's a new wave if you want to think about it in those terms. But even the language we use, I think we have to get away from that, and we have to understand that COVID season or COVID seasons are analogous to flu season, and we can't allow new cases to cripple our ability to continue living.
We should stop counting cases. We should stop premising policy on cases.
Did Governor Newsom and the cabinet up in Sacramento respond to the Great Barrington Declaration?
I never heard one word from the Governor Newsom about this. And from the evidence of the policies that the state adopted, it did not adopt anything like the principles of the Great Barrington Declaration. I think to give him some credit, there was some effort to protect nursing homes, which was quite good, and eventually older people did eventually get vaccinated, which I think is quite a good thing. But the worst things that they did, Governor Newsom did, was close the schools for an extended period of time and create and maintain anxiety over COVID, which caused an enormous disruption and psychological disruption in the lives of so many people, and still, I think, still doing that. And I think, and then the vaccine mandates, which have created a two-class society, the sense of like there's some people who are good and clean and other people who are not. I think those are the bad policies that I think I would hope that Governor Newsom would reverse.
This is a hard question. Was the pandemic planned?
It depends on what you mean by that. I think there were a lot of economic and financial interests that, again, have been preparing for 20 years to implement a certain type of response to a certain kind of threat. Because it advanced certain interests to do that. A lot of people made a lot of money during the pandemic, but those were people at the very top of the socioeconomic pyramid. So there's a massive transfer of wealth from the working class and the middle class, not just to the upper class, but to the tech elites, really. Amazon lobbied for lockdowns. Why would Amazon lobby for lockdowns? Well, look at its business model. Right? You close small businesses, you eliminate the competition. People are at home, afraid to go out. They start ordering and doing more of their commerce online. Amazon profits skyrocketed. Jeff Bezos' net worth skyrocketed. So there were global economic interests that benefited from the policy approaches that we took. And many of those interests are very powerful. Right? Tech controls the flow of information. And if tech benefits from the lockdowns, they have an interest in controlling the flow of information from people like Dr. Bhattacharya, Dr. Kolarf got kicked off Twitter. Both of us are involved in a free speech lawsuit, looking at the way in which federal government may have colluded, we're alleging colluded with social media companies to censor. Social media companies as private entities can arguably decide what goes on and what doesn't go on their platforms, but the federal government cannot dictate terms to the social media companies about what they can censor. That's a clear violation of the First Amendment. So I don't think it was planned in the sense of an evil cabal of people that had designs to kill large segments of the population. I think there's a lot of evidence that the virus itself came from gain-of-function research, likely from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, although that evidence is not definitive. I think the preponderance of evidence is tilting in that direction, and we need a clear investigation to establish whether the virus was man-made. I think if it leaked, the leak was probably accidental. Given the standards, people had raised concerns about biosafety standards at that specific BSL-4 biosafety lab in Wuhan. So it's entirely plausible that this thing walked out on somebody's shoe and made its way into the population. I think aspects of our response, as I suggested in my remarks, were planned. They've been in the works for about 20 years. I have a book coming out next month called The New Abnormal, where I try to get into some of that history. Okay, where did this come from and who benefited from this and what were the interests at work that caused us to go down that path? And I don't think it requires a really complicated conspiracy to explain it. I mean, a simple explanation would involve following the money. And that's sort of one of the threads that I try to go down in that book. But I think a lot of what was done was not necessarily done with any sort of nefarious purpose. I think there were a confluence of a lot of complicated factors that led us to do things that were not wise. And so the questions for us now is not so who's the evil person in the position of power that needs to be punished for making bad decisions or forcing bad decisions on the population. I think we need to look at the systemic issues that are at work in our scientific, public health, medical institutions that didn't allow for meaningful conversation, meaningful, dissent, and a more open democratic process in terms of decision making. So I'm an advocate of systemic reforms rather than trying to pin the blame on this or that bad person.
Let me reemphasize that because I completely agree with that. If it was just Tony Fauci did it, it would be so simple. But it's not Tony Fauci did it. Tony Fauci is a symptom of the broader problem. And so many of the actors that launched themselves in did it with good intentions, but ultimately led to all the outcomes I talked about during my talk. It's a systematic problem created by the way our society is structured that led to this problem, led to these outcomes. And so we have to think systematically about how to reform so that we don't have this happen again. Our society is vulnerable to fear and panic in a way we never thought before. And that fear and panic causes pathology that we never imagined could happen. And so, exactly. And so we have to think about how to make it so that we don't panic when we are faced with a threat like this, so that when people want these kinds of actions that violate our deepest values, we have a societal immune system that says no.
I'm going to add one remark. An institution like this has to look at its own response during the pandemic as well. I have no idea what LMU did, so I don't want to single out this college or even colleges, but I think one of the things that happened with many of our institutions, our workplaces, our schools, and so forth, was a kind of risk management approach to the pandemic. And by risk management, I mean, we don't want to be held responsible or liable for a student dying, because we didn't adopt a policy that was stringent enough. And so you get into the lawyers advising the institutions on risk management get into a sort of mindset where, if some other college is doing something more stringent and we're doing something more relaxed, and we have a bad outcome, then we're not going to be able to defend ourselves, right? That kind of logic leads to more and more stringent, and I would argue more and more extreme measures, not because that's the best way to handle the situation or that's the most prudent course of action, but simply out of an effort, I think a misguided effort to avoid liability. And many American institutions are subject to this kind of logic. And I think that was one of the real vulnerabilities and weaknesses that happened during the pandemic, is that logic led us not to a path of moderation, but to a very untested extreme path in order to say, okay, this thing didn't happen on my watch, or I did everything, University administrators wanted to tell the parents, we did everything we could to make sure your children were safe. And what they meant was safe from this virus, not safe from depression, suicide, alcohol abuse. It was all about COVID. And public health can never be about just one illness. It has to be about the health of the population as a whole.
I want to share some of the comments of appreciation that came through on the cards. And one of them, really, to both of these fine professors, says, thank you for your courage. And at somewhat great risk. They've really spoken truth to power. And a comment here, you were always a breath of fresh air. And particularly when you appeared on the Laura Ingraham show. And how we really need to, I think, heed the wisdom with which Naveen invited us to remember, which is the wisdom of the middle path of moderation, and heed the wisdom of following the science. And we know that this is a disease that affects the elderly. We know that the youth have great resilience. And in spending now a couple of days with Dr. Bhattacharya and getting to know Dr. Karati this afternoon, I know that I'm edified, I'm educated, I'm more relaxed, and my wife the same. She had to leave a little bit early. But I think that as citizens, we need to find that way to help the lonely become less lonely and to affirm the goodness in what we can find. And there's plenty of goodness to go around. So I really thank you all for giving your time and attention. And although we're living in unpleasant times, don't let this make you an unpleasant person. So thank you.